Well, last year when Julie and I went to Canada, we took our trip to Canada, we went into an art gallery. And in this art gallery, there was a special exhibit with probably about 200 or 300 pieces in it. But they were all by locals. And they were all the same size. They weren't very big. They were all the same size, but they were all different. Some of them were good and some of them were not so good. Some were done with paint, some were done with crayon, some were photos, some were a collage, some just had words written, and some were 3D. In fact, the one had a bunch of stuff glued together, even had a little Matchbox car on it. They were different, but they were on exhibit together because they were all done by locals, people who lived there in town. When we come to this passage, we read the passage we're looking at today, it feels a little like that art exhibit. Like a bunch of different things stuck together. You've got a bit of this and that, but it's all tied together. It's all related in one way or another to Solomon's building projects. And there were a lot of them. But is related to his building projects and his great success. And which, by the way, also reflects on God, who promised that success to him and made it happen. And that's where we start this morning, with the promises and responsibility. Chapter 9 and verse 1. He says, as soon as Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord and the king's house and all that Solomon desired to build, the Lord appeared to Solomon a second time, as he had appeared to him at Gibeon. And the Lord said to him, I have heard your prayer and your plea, which you have made before me. I have consecrated this house that you have built by putting my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will be there for all time. So this is actually about the 24th year of Solomon's reign. He started building the temple in the 4th year of his reign. It took about 7 years to build the temple, and then it took about 13 years to finish his palace complex. So this has been a while. And if you remember last week when we were looking at the passage, Solomon dedicated the temple when it had been finished, when they finished building it. And during that dedication, Solomon prayed. And in his prayer, there was a lot of praise to God, and he asked God to hear the prayers of his people. And at that time, God had let Solomon know that he had heard his prayer and was going to answer that prayer, and consecrated the temple, or set it apart for himself, that he would be there and meet with his people there. And if you remember, he did that because there was a fire that came down and consumed the offering, and there was the cloud that came and filled the temple, representing the presence of God there with his people. And so, but now, years later, God speaks to Solomon in a dream like he had before. Before, it was just when he was about to start the building of the temple. He had been gathering materials. He was just about to start. Now, he's talking to Solomon, and he's telling him that he has heard his prayer. You know, that prayer that he gave at the dedication of the temple about 12 or 13 years prior to this. But God here is confirming that he has chosen to set that temple apart as his house, and that he will meet with his people there. But God also says here, if you see at the end, he says, my eyes and my heart will be there. And by saying this, he says, my eyes, that he will be attentive to and listen to the prayers of the people. And that his heart will be there, meaning he will truly love and care for the people. Now, this message from God to Solomon is also recorded in 2 Chronicles 7, verses 11 to 16, but there's some more details in there. I don't have time to read it, but let me just tell you, in 2 Chronicles, God speaks about several possible bad situations And these are all situations that Solomon had mentioned in his prayer. These bad situations are things that were also all associated with the covenant between God and Israel, with the covenant blessings and curses. When God said, if you obey me, I will bless you. So I'll make rain come and your crops will grow and things will be well with you. But if you disobey me, I will curse you. There won't be rain and your crops won't grow, or there will be other problems. So God mentions some of these as Solomon had mentioned them in his prayer. And basically what he's saying that is, so if Israel turns away from God to false gods, then God, the real God, will cause it not to rain, or he will send locusts to destroy their crops, or he will send sickness to the nation of Israel in order to discipline them, to make so that they will realize the error of their way and turn back to God and start worshiping him alone. And God says that when they do, and this is the thing, there was always the opportunity for repentance. He says, when this happens, you can turn back to me. And when you turn back to me and repent, then God says that he who is faithful, he promises to hear their prayers, to respond to their prayers, and he will keep the covenant that he has promised. But here's the question. Why did God appear this second time and tell this to Solomon after so many years had passed? I mean, it's been about 12 or 13 years since he prayed this prayer. Well, there's nothing that tells us specifically why, but I think we may have a clue in what God says next. Look at verse 4, back in 1 Kings 9, verse 4. It says, and as for you, if you will walk before me as David your father walked, with integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I have commanded you, and keeping my statutes and my rules, then I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father, saying, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. But if you turn aside from following me, you or your children, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes that I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land that I have given them. And the house that I have consecrated for my name, I will cast out of my sight. And Israel will become a proverb and a byword among the peoples. And this house will become a heap of ruins. Everyone passing by it will be astonished and will hiss, and they will say, why has the Lord done thus to this land and to this house? Then they will say, because they abandoned the Lord their God, who brought their fathers out of the land of Egypt, and laid hold on other gods, and worshipped them and served them. Therefore, the Lord has brought all this disaster on them. God is reminding Solomon here to keep his eyes on God, to remain faithful. But if we read ahead in Solomon's story, we know that at some point Solomon fails to do this, and he will worship other gods. And so here, about 13 years after he finished the temple, and he's been working on a lot of other stuff, we wonder if possibly his devotion and his passion for God is beginning to waver. Or maybe God just simply knows that it's going to. When I read this, it appears to me that it's God's grace. He is reminding of the promise. And he is reminding Solomon of his responsibilities. And says, there are conditions for you receiving the blessings from me. So what was required? What were these things that God said he needed to do? There were 3 things he mentions. 1, he was to walk with integrity of heart. He to have integrity of heart. Now, integrity means being whole or undivided. That's why we say that someone has integrity if they're like honest, if they do what they say, because they tell the truth and it's actually the truth. It fits. It all matches. When they don't say one thing and then say something different. They're not lying. Or they don't say one thing and do something different. It's all fit. It's complete. It's whole. It's undivided. And so living with living with an integrity of heart means living wholeheartedly for God. Being fully devoted to God with undivided loyalty. And this makes an important point. As God is coming to talk to Solomon. What does it mean to live for God? Well, it's not just about what you do, but it's about your heart. And it starts with the heart. Secondly, he was to live with uprightness. This means simply being moral and doing what's right and good. And thirdly, he says, doing according to all that I have commanded you. This is pretty straightforward. He is to obey God. Obey all that God said. And so it starts with the heart, and then it's lived out in actions. But this is what God required. But if Solomon or his descendants who were kings after him turned away from God and failed to disobey, and they followed other gods, there will be dire consequences for all of Israel. You see, the king represented all the people. And as the king went, the people went. And oftentimes, usually, when the king lived a certain way, the people would follow him. And so he was responsible to lead in a way that honored God and brought the people to follow God. But they were all together in this. But God says there will be these dire consequences, but in his grace, he gives this strong warning to Solomon, and he encourages him to be faithful. Now, look at the strong warnings. First, he says that Israel will be cut off from the land. And so he's saying that Israel will be completely separated from the promised blessing. They will be removed from the land. Now, the first readers of this book were Israelites who were in exile, who had been removed from the land. And I can imagine them reading this and saying, "We knew better." But God also gives this warning about the temple. He says that the temple, in which God had chosen to be present, he said that it would be cast out of his sight. Now, this word cast out is often used for divorce. And that is what's being pictured here. A total severing of ties. God is saying that he will reject that temple, that he will have nothing to do with that temple. Of course, this makes an important point as well. It's not the temple itself that is great. It's not the temple itself that brings blessing. It's God. God is the one who is great. God is the one who brings blessing. And so, if God has disassociated himself with the temple is meaningless. The third warning, he says that Israel will become a proverb and a byword for all the non-Israelites who come by and see what has happened. What he means by this, a proverb, that Israel will become a cautionary tale. They will see the destroyed temple and they ask, why did God do this? And they'll be told, well, because God delivered them from Egypt. He was their God. He blessed them. He brought them into this land. And then they turned away from him and started following other gods, false gods. And they will say, this doesn't make any sense at all, but that's what they did. Don't be like that. They're a proverb. And he also said they will be a byword. In other words, that Israel would then be synonymous with rejecting God and suffering the consequences of rejecting God. Let me give you an example of a byword. If I mention the name Benedict Arnold, what do you think? Traitor. Right? Most people don't know anything else about him but that he was a traitor. He's a byword. And so what he's saying is that's the way Israel would be. People mention Israel, the people who turn away from God and suffer the consequences. That wasn't very wise. But as we read this, what we see here is that God is actually full of grace. He's not just waiting around for people to mess up so he can punish them. But he blesses his people, and he reminds his people what is right, and he warns his people. You see, he wants what is best for his people, and he calls them to be faithful. Whether we're talking about the Israelites thousands of years ago, or we're talking about Christians today, he wants to bless his people, and he calls us to be faithful. Now, some may see a challenge like this to obey God, and the idea of God requiring obedience. Some may see that as a heavy demand. Or you may also see it as grace, a gracious offer from God. And really it comes down to a matter of the heart, a matter of undivided loyalty. You see, if you have that undivided loyalty, if you have that heart that is towards God, it gives you a different perspective. And so the question that I would ask then is, so is your obeying God, is it a chore? Or is it joyful submission? Part of the abundant life that we enjoy in Christ. Well, as we read on now, we're told about several things related to Solomon's building projects. Look at verse 10. It says, at the end of 20 years in which Solomon had built the two houses, the house of the Lord and the king's house, and Hiram, king of Tyre, had supplied Solomon with cedar and cypress timber and gold as much as he desired, King Solomon gave to Hiram 20 cities in the land of Galilee. See, what had happened is Hiram had provided so many materials that Solomon couldn't pay him back with just oil and wheat. It required more. It was more expensive than that. So he gave him some cities, some towns. Verse 12, but when Hiram came from Tyre to see the cities that Solomon had given him, they did not please him. Now, these were border towns, so they were near between Israel and Tyre. But he comes to see them, and he doesn't like them. In other words, he is not impressed at all. Have you ever walked into a house when you're looking for a house, and you're like, ooh, look at that's falling apart, and I don't like that, and it smells, and okay, this is the feeling you get here. Hiram went and saw these cities, and he's like, I don't like it. Verse 13, therefore he said, what kind of cities are these that you have given me, my brother? He's like, are you trying to pull a fast one on me? He feels like he's not, that Solomon hasn't been fair with him. So they are called the land of Kabul to this day. Hiram had sent to the king 120 talents of gold. The word Kabul means like nothing. In other words, worthless. And so that's what he said they were, and that's how they've been called since that time. We'll keep reading verse 15. And this is the account of the forced labor that King Solomon drafted to build the house of the Lord, and his own house, and the Millo, and the wall of Jerusalem, and Hazar, and Megiddo, and Gezer. Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had gone up and captured Gezer, and burnt it with fire, and had killed the Canaanites who lived in the city, and had given it as a dowry to his daughter, Solomon's wife. So Solomon rebuilt Gezer. and Lower Beth-horn, and Baalath, and Tamar in the wilderness of the land of Judah, and all the store cities that Solomon had, and the cities for his chariots, and the cities for his horsemen, and whatever Solomon desired to build in Jerusalem, in Lebanon, and in all the land of his dominion. All the people who were left of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, who were not of the people of Israel, their descendants who were left after them in the land, whom the people of Israel were unable to devote to destruction, these Solomon drafted to be slaves, and so they are to this day. But of the people of Israel, Solomon made no slaves. They were the soldiers, they were his officials, his commanders, his captains, his chariot commanders, and his horsemen. These were the chief officers who were over Solomon's work, 550 who had charge of the people who carried on the work. And so, this is how Solomon had many building projects. He was likely building something throughout his entire reign. But here we're told about the fortified cities, cities where they built strong walls, they were very well protected. And so some of these were fortresses guarding various entrances to the land, and some of them were store cities in order to keep things like chariots and horses. And one of them, we're told, was a wedding gift from Pharaoh. And the Canaanites had been living there, and the Israelites had not been able to conquer them during the conquest. And so at this point, Pharaoh had come up, and he had taken that city, and he killed everyone who was living there, and he burned the city, and then he gave it to Solomon and his wife for a wedding present. And so Solomon rebuilt it. But all of this work required a lot of labor. And in addition to the Israelites who were temporarily conscripted into the service of Solomon, there were also slaves who were non-Israelites, the ones who had not been conquered by the Israelites during the conquest. And we remember they didn't conquer everyone because they didn't trust God and do everything that he had said. But some of them were still there, but those who were there were now made slaves to serve in the building projects. Well, we continue on verse 24 then. He says, "But Pharaoh's daughter went up from the city of David to her own house that Solomon had built for her. Then he built the Millo." Now, the Millo, we're not exactly certain what it is, but it's probably some sort of supporting terrace. Most people believe that's what it was, a supporting terrace there in Jerusalem. But the point here is that they didn't start the work till after Pharaoh's wife had moved into her new home that Solomon had built her. Now, just a little side note here. Pharaoh's daughter is the only foreign wife of Solomon that has been mentioned so far. But we're told about her housing situation a couple of times. At first, we were told that she was living in the city of David before Solomon finished all of his building and moved her. Now we're told that they didn't start this other till she moved. And you might wonder, why is this an issue? Why are we mentioning her housing situation? Well, 2 Chronicles 8:11 says that she could not live in David's palace because the ark had been there, and therefore it was considered holy. She had to live in a separate place because she worshiped false gods. You see, when she married Solomon, she did not give up her idolatry. And so she could not live in a place that was holy or set apart to God. That'll be interesting to remember when we get to the rest of the story of Solomon. Verse 25. 3 times a year, Solomon used to offer up burnt offerings and peace offerings on the altar that he built to the Lord, making offerings with it before the Lord. So he finished the house. We're told here 3 times a year Solomon would make these offerings. And these 3 times a year, this is referring to the 3 big religious feasts in Israel where they would offer sacrifices. But this is making the point that Solomon is now making his offerings at the temple rather than at the high places. This is telling us that Solomon is faithfully worshiping God. In other words, this is good. What Solomon's doing is good. So Solomon is faithfully following God, and God is blessing him with great success and fame. And the rest of the passage tells us about his success and fame. Look at verse 26 and 27. It says, King Solomon built a fleet of ships at Ezion-Geber, which is near Eloth, and on the shore of the Red Sea in the land of Edom. And Hiram sent with the fleet his servants, seamen, who were familiar with the sea, together with the servants of Solomon, and they went to Ophir and brought from there gold, 420 talents, and they brought it to King Solomon. And so here we have this simple statement. It tells us that he still has an alliance with Hiram. Apparently Hiram wasn't too upset about the cities. In fact, Chronicle says he gave them back. But they still have this alliance. Apparently Hiram understands that he has a lot of money to make by being in an alliance with Solomon. And so he tells us about this, that Solomon then built these ships, and Hiram provided the experienced crews for the ships. And they sailed around the Red Sea, and they traded, and they brought home a lot of goods. And they specifically mention a lot of gold from Ophir, because Ophir was known for pure gold. Keep reading chapter 10, verse 1. Now when the queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions. She came to Jerusalem with a very great retinue, with camels bearing spices and a very much gold and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she told him all that was on her mind. And Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing hidden from the king that he could not explain to her. And so here we have the Queen of Sheba. The Queen of Sheba had heard about Solomon and had to see it for herself. His fame is most likely spreading through the traders who passed through Israel. And the news of his greatness is traveling fast. It's traveling far. Because Sheba was actually a major trade center, but it was way down in the southwest corner of Arabia, down at the bottom of the Red Sea where it meets the Indian Ocean. So down there in that corner. But what we see here is that as God promised, no one else of that time was more famous than Solomon. Everybody was hearing about him. But notice what it says in verse 1. When it talks about his fame, it says that she heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord. So his fame concerning the name of the Lord. Solomon's fame is connected to God. In other words, when they hear about Solomon, they heard about his God. His great reputation is associated with his relationship with God. The idea is if he is as great as she has heard, then his God must be truly amazing. His reputation reflects on the greatness of his God. It is a testimony to God's greatness. So she comes to town. The Queen of Sheba, she comes down, and it is a big deal. She has a huge caravan, and they bring lots of spices and gold and precious stones. And it's so impressive, in fact, that many legends actually built up in that part of the world about this visit from the Queen of Sheba to Solomon. In fact, I even saw part of a movie one time that was made that was all legend. But it was except for the fact that she came with a lot of stuff. Right? But these legends grew up around it. It was a big deal, and it was impressive. But it says that she came to test him with hard questions. In other words, she wants to see if what she's heard is really true. Is he as wise as I've been told? And so she asked these hard questions. These hard questions, they could be riddles or difficult, perplexing sayings or questions about philosophy or theology or even just practical things like, how do you do this? What's the best way to do this? How do things work? And smart people would challenge each other with these kinds of questions to see if they were really as wise as they said they were. Of course, she may also just be looking for answers to some questions that she has. But she asks all her questions, and he answers all of the questions. There is nothing that he couldn't explain to her. Keep reading verse 4. And when the queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food of his table, the seating of his officials, and the attendance of his servants, their clothing, his cupbearers, and his burnt offerings that he offered at the house of the Lord, there was no more breath in her. And she said to the king, the report was true that I heard in my own land of your words and of your wisdom, but I did not believe the reports until I came and my own eyes had seen it. And behold, the half was not told me. Your wisdom and prosperity surpass the report that I heard. Happy are your men, happy are your servants who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom. Blessed be the Lord your God who has delighted in you and set you on the throne of Israel. Because the Lord loved Israel forever, he has made you king, that you may execute justice and righteousness. How does she describe her, or how did they describe her reaction? It says, there was no more breath in her. That's a very literal translation. His wisdom was breathtaking, we might say. It left her breathless, so overwhelmed that she couldn't breathe. This is what they're saying here. She was totally amazed. But it wasn't just his answers that amazed her. Solomon is more than just an idea guy. He's more than just an intellectual. He's also done great things and all these things around him. She sees all his building projects. She sees how his court works. She sees how everything is run. She sees just their clothing and everything and the offerings, and she's totally and completely impressed with it. And what does she say? She says, it must be a great honor for his people to have such a great king. I mean, they get to hear his wisdom, but also a wise king brings prosperity and brings good, and all of his people benefit from his wise rule. But then she goes on and she praises Solomon's God because he has chosen Solomon and made him king. You see, by the fact that she chose Solomon and made him king, she knows that God truly loves Israel because he's given them such a great king who will do what's right and who will bring about justice. And so she sees the truth that God is blessing Israel. And so again, we see that Solomon's wisdom and his fame are a testimony to the greatness of God. Not just Solomon himself, but to the greatness of God, and that God is a loving God. Keep reading verse 10. It says, then she gave the king 120 talents of gold and a very great quantity of spices and precious stones. Never again came such an abundance of spices that the queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. Moreover, the fleet of Hiram, which brought gold from Ophir, brought from Ophir a very great amount of almug wood and precious stones, and the king made of the almug wood supports for the house of the Lord and for the king's house, also lyres and harps for the singers. No such almug wood has come or been seen to this day. And King Solomon gave to the queen of Sheba all that she desired, whatever she asked, beside what was given to her by the bounty of King Solomon. So she turned and went back to her own land with her servants. And so here we're told that all the spices and the gold and the precious stones that she brought with her, she gave it to Solomon. By the way, Sheba was known for spices. that they had great spices. So this was good stuff. And we're told it was the largest amount that ever came into Israel. And then we get this parenthetical remark about other goods. Speaking of good stuff that came into Israel, here's a bunch of other goods that came in, that were imported into Israel. And it included some wood that he used for making musical instruments. And then we're told that Solomon gave gifts to the queen, whatever she asked for. Now, this may imply they were actually making a trade, but it's pictured or treated like gifts between dignitaries. So the queen goes home, and then we're told of all the important, we're going to read next, all the important things that Solomon did, his importing and the business deals that he made. And the chapter ends with this summary of his great wealth and success. It's kind of like saying, look how good it was. Verse 14, chapter 10, verse 14. Says, now the weight of the gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold, besides that which came from the explorers and from the business of the merchants, and from all the kings of the west, and from the governors of the land. King Solomon made 200 large shields of beaten gold. 600 shekels of gold went into each shield. And he made 300 shields of beaten gold. 3 minas of gold went into each shield. And the king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. The king also made a great ivory throne and overlaid it with the finest gold. The throne had 6 steps, and the throne had a round top, and on each side of the seat were armrests, and 2 lions standing beside the armrests, while 12 lions stood there, one on each end of a step on the 6 steps. The like of it was never made in any kingdom. All King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. None were of silver. Silver was not considered as anything in the days of Solomon. For the king had a fleet of ships of Tarshish at sea and a fleet of Hiram. Once every 3 years the fleet of ships of Tarshish used to come, bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. Thus King Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. And the whole earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put into his mind. Every one of them brought his present, articles of silver and gold, garments, myrrh, spices, horses, and mules, so much year by year. And Solomon gathered together chariots and horsemen. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, whom he stationed in the chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. And the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stone, and he made cedar as plentiful as the sycamore of the Shephelah. And Solomon's import of horses was from Egypt and Cu, and the king's traders received them from Cu at a price. A chariot could be imported from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver, and a horse for 150. And so through the king's traders they were exported to all the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Syria. So things were extravagant and luxurious during the time of Solomon. It says that he brought in 666 talents of gold. That's about 25 tons of gold. We say that there was a ton of gold. Literally, tons of gold. And again, I imagine the very first readers, those Israelites who were in exile, reading this and they say, I can't believe we ever had it so good. Why did we turn away from God? You see, sin really makes a mess of life, doesn't it? But we're also told here that Solomon brought in great amounts of wealth each year through all of his business deals and through exploring and from tribute from the foreign kings and from taxes. And because he controlled the trade routes, he made money off of everyone who traveled through to make trades. Made money off of all the nations around him. Then we're told he made these ceremonial shields, and he had, there was so much gold that he had in land that he made 200 large body-sized shields. So these are the big ones that you could hide behind, and 300 smaller handheld shields. And they were like the ones that were used in battle, but these were covered in gold. And we're told that he hung them up on display in his summer home. And he made a throne that was covered in ivory and gold. It was on an elevated platform with 6 steps up to it, and there were carved lions on each side of the throne and on each step. And there was so much silver available in his time that it was considered commonplace. It wasn't anything special like the rocks, rather than a valuable, precious metal. And there was so much gold that Solomon used it even for common things like drinking cups. And he also imported expensive and exotic goods and animals. Peacocks and apes. Maybe he had a zoo. And he imported many horses and chariots, and he would buy and sell and trade and make money off of them. But all of this makes it sound like they had it all. They had everything they needed and everything they wanted. God blessed them and blessed Solomon with success and riches. And we're told that kings came from all over to hear his wisdom that was given to him by God. God made him wise, and the world knew it. Now we read this, and this is all very positive, but there's one thing that feels a little ominous to me when I read it. And that's the many horses and chariots that he accumulated. Because it reminds me of the prohibition in the law against accumulating horses rather than trusting God. And then it reminds us of that warning that we read a little bit earlier, where God gave Solomon, God warned Solomon to live before him in faithful obedience. But what we've seen in this chapter is that Solomon is worshiping God. But then we start to wonder, is his heart undivided? Is he becoming distracted by other things? Is he drifting? Now, we may have these questions because we know the end of the story. But the main overall picture that we see here, and the point that is being made in these chapters, is that God is blessing Solomon as he promised. He is successful and he is famous. And this is a testimony to God's greatness. Now, you and I may not have great wisdom or great wealth or fame like Solomon. And it hasn't been promised to us either, like it was to Solomon. But as believers in Jesus, we are blessed by God. Need just a couple quick examples? How about joy? The joy of the Lord. How about peace? The peace that passes understanding. God has blessed us. And like we saw a couple weeks ago, we do have some great promises. And I would say even better promises than wealth and fame on this world. And though you may not have fame like Solomon, you do have a reputation. And the question I want to challenge you with this morning is, what is it? What is your reputation? I mean, what are you known for? We saw this verse last Sunday during our Focus on Outreach. Matthew 5:16 says, "In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." You have a reputation. But what is it? What testimony does your life speak about God? It starts with the heart. But then we live a life of faithfulness, of faithful obedience, and of worship. And we live for His glory. May our lives, our reputations, be a testimony to the greatness and the glory of our God.